Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name's Adrian. It is the 8th of February, and this is my weekly video debating point. So a few weeks ago, I did a video on safety tools, which got a lot of conversation going, a lot of mostly positive points. There was a few negatives on there, which, you've got to expect it if you're going to do a controversial subject like safety tools. It did sadly cost me a couple of my Patreons, so I did have a couple of Patreon members actually leave because of that video, which, within their own rights. But obviously I do have a Patreon, so I probably should mention it more often. So if you do want to support me, please do jump onto my Patreon. I've got a $1, $5 and $10 pledge on there. So the $1 just, helps me sort of keep the channel going, really, and update microphones, buy new books and things like that, update. So I'm trying to build a website and sort of make myself a little bit more professional, if that makes sense. So all the money is going back into there. But one of the most reoccurring themes that came off that safety tools video was people saying that I don't worry about safety tools because I'm the games master and I'm going to pick the players I want at my table. And that's what you should do. And I was like, and it wasn't, I'm not going to put up the comments, if you want to go and find the people in the comments, feel free to do that. But it's not, I don't want to call people out, if that makes sense. But there was a lot of comments down that road. And I was like, do you know what? I think that is a good topical point. Because should we, as games masters, pick our players or just accept the players that we have and bend to them? That's what I'm going to discuss today. And obviously at the end of the video, let me know your thoughts and your feelings on that. This is not designed to start a fight or cause controversy in any way, but I just want to have an honest talk about boundaries and expectations. I think from a games master's point of view that you should expect from your players, because, let's talk about the reality of a games master. Because as a games master, you're not just a player. You're not just turning up to a session where you can, if you're one of those, genius level people that just turns up and just wings the whole thing. But as a general rule, you've invested money in a book. Games Master screen, you've got probably additional books, because more often than not now, it's not just a core book. So you've spent money, you've spent time learning the rules, practicing the combats, making sure the game's going to flow. You've built your campaign potentially, learned how to do your hex crawl, or you've pre-bought an adventure to run alongside it. You've invested all of this. So you're the one that's put in all the work. So realistically, should you be the one that then gets to sit back and go, I'll have you, but not you and you? Like picking a jury duty, it's not quite as... most of us aren't in that privileged position to be able to sort of cherry pick people. I'm not saying you should exclude, but is there an element of when you're running, especially if you're going to do a campaign, that you need to make sure you've got the right players to create and run the campaign that you want to run? As much as the players are going to influence the campaign and they're going to give it direction and life, you're the one that has got to run it. You're the one that's got to spend time at the end of the session fleshing out the NPCs, the encounters, and everything going into the very next session. You're doing all the work. You're investing time, something you're never getting back. And the players mostly are just going to turn up, invest their time at that table, and just have fun. Okay, so that's really what we're looking at. Because not every games master wants to run the game that the players are going to want to run. You might want to run a dark fantasy adventure. You might want to go something that's going to be highly lethal along those sort of routes. And, not all players are going to want to play in that sort of environment. They may want a cozy story. And you're like, no, I want to run a dark, gritty Warhammer world where players are going to die. It's, do you really want to get into a combat and risk combat? They might want to play a high fantasy, heroic-based game. But that's probably not going to work. So you should really be going, if you want to play that, then, at this club, you want to go and sit on Barry's table, because that's the game Barry's running. I'm running this because this is what I want to run. Now, hopefully, you're going to have players, because obviously if you haven't got players, the whole rest of this video is pretty much a moot point, because, this kind of implies that you can have a variety of players. But one thing that did kind of come up also in the video is life doesn't have safety tools. And I may have talked about that. And it kind of dawned on me, and this is going to be a very personal correction, that life does have safety tools. And, have we got freedom of speech? Yes. Can I come on my YouTube channel and say whatever I want? Yes, I can. However, am I free from consequences? No. I could come out and say some horrific things on my channel that I may or may not believe. I hope you get my point, if that makes sense. But that doesn't mean that everyone's going to either unsubscribe to me, they might report me to the police, they might report me to YouTube. There's lots of things that people say that should have consequences. This is the roll into my consistent "don't be a dick" rule that goes along my channel. It's just the whole thing in life. There's think about Roadhouse. Strange example now, and there's a lot of people may or may not know what Roadhouse is. It's I think it was at 89, and the whole ethos of Roadhouse was be kind. Yeah, and that's really how we should all be in the world. Obviously we should be kind, but there's an element where you're going to want to run the game that you want to run. So regarding life and having safety tools, life does have safety tools, and if you're looking at working, I'll explain in a second. I employ quite a lot of people. I also have, within my practice, we have an awful lot of self-employed advisors, and we have a culture within the practice that isn't said. I probably couldn't put it in writing exactly what our culture is, but whenever I'm looking to recruit another manager, I want my manager to have the same culture of the company. So they would have spent time in the practice, and we tend to promote within, because we pick people that sort of, we're not on about political opinions here or football teams or religion. I'm on about a work ethos of how they view sort of compliance, safety, sales skills, advice to clients, if that makes sense. So we have that really, it's an unwritten culture, but we all know what we're doing. And that kind of is the sort of thing that we have with role-playing books. But coming back to the rules, but also within our practice, we have a code of conduct. We have regulation. There are laws that we have to abide by. In the working environment, there are things you can and can't say. I just can't walk up to another member of staff and smack them on the bottom, because there are boundaries. Well, I could do it, but there are repercussions of the things I'm going to say. Again, don't be a dick. You can't just go around touching people. Role playing, it's all building into the same thing, if that makes sense. That you just should not treat people in an abhorrent or disgusting way. Even relationships have boundaries. There are things that you're going to have consent with your relationship. You're going to have limits. There's going to be communication that you're going to sort of build up. You're also going to have, let's go for this one, safety words, because that might be the sort of relationship you've got. That is a type of safety tool. So maybe my video 2 weeks ago was a little bit ignorant when I look at it, that I should probably relate it a little bit more to working environments and real life environments. I'd say you mess up in the workplace or you mess up in a relationship, that relationship's over. From a workplace point of view, you're getting sued. Someone is leaving, and it's going to cost you financially. It might cost you the reputation of your company and stuff. It might also close the company down. And in the comments for the safety tools video, several people brought up, and I'm not gonna name games masters or things like that, but there was certain games masters now that have basically been thrown out of the industry and hobby space. There's Reddit streams about them, there's YouTube videos about them. People that have done some pretty disgusting stuff sat around the table, and it goes beyond not being a dick. This is just stuff that should not happen anywhere in the workplace. It shouldn't happen in life. And if it's the sort of thing that shouldn't happen in life, it definitely shouldn't happen at a role-playing table. But so getting back to the point is, there needs to be an agreement, I think, that as the games master, and you kind of, I'm going to come back to the don't be a dick point of view, but treat it like a workspace. Sort of set out your rules and set out your game and your play, and obviously, pick the people that you want to have there, but you also need to make sure that you don't need to be accountable for their fun. okay, because that is very subjective on whether they're actually having fun. But you still need to be accountable and make sure that you're not crossing any form of boundary, I think is the point I'm making. So should the GM pick a player? Yes, I definitely think the games master should pick the players. Equally, the players should also pick the table they want to sit at. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's not just the game master going, I want you to play in my game because you're a really good role player. I want you to pick in my game because we're politically aligned. I want you to play in my game because I know you're not going to cry if there happens to be a rabbit that is killed in the adventure. That's kind of not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about players and games masters sort of wanting to play the same game, the same sort of style. It's going to come to that, because one of the things from the games master's point of view is one of the big reasons that you're going to pick is you might want to run a game that isn't for beginners. You don't want to. Let's say you're going to run. I'm going to use Warhammer Fantasy Role Playing. Let's say you want to run a Warhammer Fantasy Role Playing in the College of Magic, and you want all people to have different winds of magic, and that's your campaign setting. That's the idea, right? That is not a campaign setting for inexperienced Warhammer players. The magic rules are so convoluted that it's not, the learning curves are bump. And you don't want a beginning player and that. There are certain games that you're going to want to run that aren't for children. And someone, one of your friends might go, can little Stevie come and play in the game? And he's 12. I was going to do a full-on Viking adventure where we're going to go and, the first place we're going to go and hit Linda's farm. And I'm going to have to change the whole adventure or run something else if Steve plays. So I'd rather little Stevie not play because I've invested all this time and this work in this game. Some campaigns also require commitment. You might have a player that, let's say, not on the police, but he might be a policeman, okay? And one of the big problems of being in the police is your shift patterns change weekly. So you might not always be free on a Tuesday night between 8 till 11 or whatever time the session. I probably don't want that player in my campaign because they're going to be missing 50, 75, 25% of the campaign. It's not too bad if you're going to do a Western Marches campaign style, but that's not what I'm doing. We're doing a full Oathhammer campaign, and we're all going to be adventuring together. I expect everyone to be there every week. And if people can't be there one week, we'll probably just not do it that week or do a one shot in there. But if someone from off the bat isn't going to be there 50% of the time because every other week they work nights because they're the police or they work in a factory or they work in a prison, whatever it may be that their schedule doesn't allow, I don't want that player at my table. Not for a campaign. Come and do loads of one shots, really. Absolutely fine. I'm going to use a real world example. I used to go to a club years ago, and there was a certain player there that I didn't like running games for because he cheated a lot. And not only dice rolls, but I had to start secretly marking the character sheet because it would come back to me and stats and skills had been increased during the session. Not through spending experience, just mildly rubbing out and increasing stuff. That isn't someone I want at my table because I can't stand cheats. I don't like liars. I don't like cheats. I don't like them is probably the wrong thing to say. I find it very hard to be around people that can't be honest, if that makes sense. If you've messed up in life, put your hand up, admit it. I can work through it. I always tell my children, if anything goes wrong, you've done something wrong at school or wherever it may be, if you've smashed a window, let's be honest, we can deal with it. You can go there, you can apologise, we can pay for it, however it is. You don't just run off and lie, if that makes sense. And I don't know, I have this big issue with honesty and integrity and things like that. If I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. People think I'm mad. I'm doing this daily zine quest, which I've said I'm going to do a daily video, and because I've said I'm going to do it, I have to do it now. Well, I don't have to do it because I think you as the viewer, subscriber, you're not going to hold me accountable. If I miss one day, you're not going to, no one's going to say anything. But in here, because I've said I'm going to do it, I need to stick to it. I've got sidetracked again, haven't I? So let's just get back to close down. There's, if you're heading into a campaign or spending a lot of time together, there's obviously, actually, let's talk about, there's a huge element of trust. You've got to trust the player. The player's got to trust the games master. But there's also a lot of emotion that goes into running sessions. I know some people like to pretend it's not. You just turning up and rolling. I don't think it's that at all. I'm spending a lot of time getting to know someone. Quite intense it can be, because a lot of people, certain aspects of their personality will be in their characters. Well, not everyone. Okay, I'm not very good at playing someone that's completely different to myself, if that makes sense, because I'm not an actor. I'm just a guy that, like, I don't even put voices on, really. My voices go hello and all right, and that's about it. I've got two voices. But you're investing all this time with the players, and it's just, and especially for people like me, when we get into like the neurodivergent games masters that have certain isms and ways about them, and especially my dyslexia being front and center, and some of the other things that I have going on in my brain, I need players sat with me on a one shot. It doesn't matter as much. I don't, I can turn up at a convention, run a one shot for 3 or 4 hours, and if I'm sat with players that I don't like, or they lie, they cheat, whatever, I can just get up and just finish a session. I'll be a little bit frustrated, but I won't let it show. If I'm doing a campaign every week, once a fortnight, once a month, whatever it may be, with someone that I'm not comfortable playing with, I don't want them at my table. So I do think there is a real big thing, that not every game is for everyone. But more importantly, not every table is for everyone. Not every games master is for everyone. And not every player is for every games master. So just before I end the video, I just want to have a little bit of a conversation here around about sort of safety tools and shared responsibility. So, they are not moral shields. They are not designed to be a control mechanism for anyone, but also they are not a substitute for bad communication, because communication is key. One of the things that you need to make sure is that you have got like a healthy table, that, and not one person's responsible for all the communication. One person isn't responsible for making sure that nobody gets triggered or upset around the table. I think it just works perfectly if everyone's honest. You just need to have that little bit of honesty around the table. You respect the limits of other people, and you've got to remember that compromise goes both ways, but also accept that you don't know what's going on in other people's minds. Final thoughts. Should the games master pick the players for his table? Yes, I do. I think it just all comes back to that. I think all of those comments and what everyone's saying is right, but I think there just needs to be, I'm really into session zeros. That's a good idea, especially with strangers. If you're going to do a campaign, talk about it. But just remember that whatever you do, you're free to write whatever event you want, run whatever game you want, but there are consequences to absolutely abhorrent actions and words. So just bear that in mind, because as much as you're picking the players you want to play with, the players equally are picking games masters that they trust, they like, and people they want to come back to tell the stories for them. It's collaborative for a reason. Everyone needs to be on board. Everyone needs to be happy. You're not going to be happy all the time, because there might be a storyline that might push your boundaries. I've recently lost my dog. I'm not overly comfortable. I've never been comfortable with stories of dogs' deaths. I'll watch First Blood and I have to sort of fast forward the bit where the dogs run off, and I don't like it. Kill a human in a film. Not overly bothered. Animals, can't stand it. But there are things that make me feel uncomfortable. But you just have to press through, because it's role playing and it's meant to be fun. Not all the time, but it will be mostly fun. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it puts a little bit of light and more clarification onto my Safety Fools video from a few weeks ago. And yeah, Games Master, go and run the table that you want, but remember, the players won't come back if you're a dick. So that is it. I'm going to leave it there. Let me know down in the comments below what you think, whether you think the Games Master should exclusively be picking the table, whether the player should pick the table, whether safety tools should still be there. But yeah, just let me know your thoughts. Remember, be nice and don't be a dick. And I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.